Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 322 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Now, this episode releases on the 4th of July, so I thought it was fitting to not only do a cartridge comparison, but focus on two rounds that have played prominent roles in U.S. military conflicts over the past half century. The .223 Remington and 5.56 NATO on one side versus the 7.62 by 39 millimeter Soviet round on the other. Now, fighters armed with the 5.56 NATO and the 7.62 by 39 have engaged in furious combat all over the world ever since military forces using those cartridges first met in the jungles of Vietnam during the 1960s. The 5.56 versus 7.62 by 39 debate kicked off shortly thereafter and has never really ended as shooters continue to intensely argue the strengths and weaknesses of each one in sporting goods shops, gun magazines, online forums, and shooting ranges. Heck, those on both sides of that debate often argue the merits of their chosen cartridge with an intense ferocity that I have rarely seen with any other cartridges, and this includes a certain other round I won't name here that rhymes with need more. Now, in this episode, I'm going to do my best to sort through the .223 5.56 versus 7.62 by 39 debate in an even-handed manner in order to help you make an informed decision on which one is right for you. This is another area where there are a lot of myths and misconceptions, and as you'll see, failings associated with the M16 rifle in particular have also really tarnished the reputation of the 5.56 NATO cartridge. The same is also true with a couple of very specific types of ammunition for that round that have poor terminal performance under certain conditions. And once again, that has really just cast a pall over the cartridge and given it a reputation that it doesn't necessarily deserve all the time. But we'll talk more about that in detail over the course of the rest of this episode. Before we get started, I have three very important admin notes to quickly talk to you about. Do not skip this because you're going to want to hear what I have to say. So first, I am pleased to announce that we are doing another big game hunting podcast hunt in Africa during July of 2025. Before I announced this hunt to the general public, I went down the list of listeners who previously contacted me expressing interest in going on another podcast hunt in Africa. For that reason, this hunt filled up almost immediately. There is one catch, though. One of the hunters booked for this hunt has a medical condition that may prevent him from joining us next summer. The details are not important, but at this point, he's probably 50-50 on whether or not he'll receive medical clearance to travel. For that reason, I want to book one guy as an alternate in case that other hunter cannot come. This hunter will know one way or another what the deal is in January of 2025. Now, this particular hunter is booked for buffalo and for plains game, so I want to book an alternate hunter who is also interested in buffalo and plains game. Shoot me an email if you're interested and we can talk details, but the gist of things is that everyone attending the podcast hunt is hunting at a discount compared to our regular pricing. If you book as an alternate, I will of course extend that same pricing to you. If the other hunter cannot come, then you can have a spot. I look forward to hunting with you and I'm sure we'll have a great time together. If that other hunter can come, then I will either refund your deposit to you in early 2025, or I will rebook you for another opening we have in our schedule, and you can hunt at the discounted price I am offering for the podcast hunt then. So you can't lose with this offer. Shoot me an email, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com with subject line podcast hunt, and we can discuss this in more detail. Now, speaking of discounted hunts, we have 3 openings remaining in our schedule for October and November 2024, and I have slashed prices for those dates. You can hunt plains game, you can hunt buffalo, you can hunt both during any of those openings. So if the tag draws did not treat you well and you're looking for something to do this fall, or if you just otherwise have an opening in October or November, and you want to hunt, this is a great opportunity to enjoy an African safari during a time of year where the hunting is fantastic, especially for kudu, impala, buffalo, and wildebeest, and you can do so at a discount. Once again, email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. I'd be happy to discuss pricing and dates in more detail with you. And finally, though I have not publicly announced details yet, we have selected a veteran that we will be hosting on a hunt in Africa for free in June of 2025, like I mentioned as part of my 5-year podcast anniversary. We have notified that veteran that we have selected him for the hunt, and we have confirmed that he will be attending. More details coming on this, but thank you for all the great submissions. Choosing a single person out of all those nominations was challenging because there were some truly amazing people in that pool, and I greatly appreciate everyone's participation in that celebration. More details coming on this hunt with this particular veteran and all of that stuff. I will keep you posted on the details of how things progress, and we'll talk more about this guy and his life story in more detail in the future, but I have received some queries asking if we had made a decision and any of that stuff. So the answer is yes. More to follow there. Okay, that's it for announcements. Let's get started talking about the 5.56, the 223, and the 7.62 by 39. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time discussing the historical roots of these cartridges, but I will hit the highlights in order to give you an idea of how and why these two rounds came into existence. Now, as strange as it may sound, the American 5.56 NATO and the Soviet 7.62 by 39 are both the result of a somewhat radical new cartridge design philosophy pioneered by the Germans in World War II. Now, specifically, they developed the STG-44 rifle, which was literally an assault rifle in the truest sense of the word that utilized a detachable box magazine and was a select fire weapon capable of both semi and fully automatic fire, and the accompanying 7.92 by 33 millimeter Kurz cartridge during World War II. The Germans did this in order to provide their soldiers with a round that had more power and a longer effective range than the pistol cartridges used in submachine guns like the 9mm Luger and the 45 ACP, but without the excess power and the more punishing recoil of a full-powered rifle cartridge like the 30-06 or the 8mm Mauser. The Germans wanted that capability because they realized typical combat ranges were usually between 100 and 300 yards, and because they appreciated the advantages of a rifle capable of either fully automatic or semi-automatic fire that was also equipped with a detachable box magazine. As you can imagine, a soldier armed with a weapon like that will have a massive advantage over a soldier armed with a more traditional bolt-action rifle like the Mauser K98 or the Mosin Nagant. The Germans introduced that new weapon and cartridge too late in the war and in numbers too small to really change the final outcome of World War II. However, the performance of the STG-44 and the 7.92 by 33 impressed the Soviets so much they decided to develop a similar rifle and cartridge for themselves. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but the 7.92 by 33 looks a heck of a lot like a shortened 7.92 by 57 millimeter round. That's the other name for the 8mm Mauser. But basically, the 7.92 by 33 has a shortened case that holds a little bit less powder, fires a bullet of the same diameter that is a little bit lighter, and since it has less powder, shoots it at a slower velocity. Well, the Soviets did a similar thing with the 7.62 by 39 relative to the older, larger, and more powerful 7.62 by 54R. Same bullet diameter, just with a shorter case, less powder. And also they designed the 7.62 by 39 to use a rimless case, unlike the rimmed 7.62 by 54R. The resulting 7.62 by 39 cartridge fired a .311 inch, 123 grain boat tail full metal jacket bullet at a muzzle velocity of about 2,300 feet per second. Over the years, the cartridge has sometimes been referred to as the 7.62 Soviet, the 7.62 Short, the 7.62 Warsaw Pact, and the 30 Russian Short. Now, featuring a rimless and highly tapered case to assist with reliable feeding and extraction, the cartridge was a big hit with the Soviet Army from the start, and the Soviets adopted a number of different weapons chambered for the cartridge, like the semi-auto SKS rifle, the RPD machine gun, and the famous or infamous AK-47 assault rifle. This also includes AK derivatives like the AKM. Now, if you put an AK-47 and a 7.62x39 cartridge next to a STG-44 and a 7.92x33 millimeter cartridge, you'll almost immediately notice they are very similar in appearance to each other. And while I wouldn't say they are directly related, the Soviets clearly modeled their new rifle and cartridge after the German designs. So that is the Soviet 7.62x39 in a nutshell. Like I mentioned earlier, the 5.56 NATO has similar roots. Now, the U.S. used the full-powered 30-06 during World War II, and they also wanted a new rifle and cartridge with many of the same advantages as the German STG-44 and 7.92 Kurz. They initially decided upon the M14 battle rifle and the 7.62x51 millimeter NATO cartridge as replacements for the 30-06 and M1 Garand. But as good as that rifle and cartridge were for many uses, the rifle was just too heavy and too difficult to control when firing in fully automatic mode. For those reasons, the U.S. military transitioned over to the lighter M16 rifle and the smaller and higher velocity 5.56x45 millimeter cartridge in the 1960s. Now, derived from the 223 Remington, the original M193 ball load for the 5.56 NATO cartridge fired a .224 caliber, 55 grain full metal jacket at 3,250 feet per second. Now, unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, both the M16 and the 5.56 NATO suffered some major teething problems during the Vietnam War, and that really tarnished the reputations of both of them. The details of that fiasco are outside the scope of this episode, but suffice to say, the failings of the M16 in particular, but the 5.56 NATO by association, were forever tarnished in the eyes of that generation of American men who fought in Vietnam. However, unfortunately, modifications to the rifle and the propellant used in the cartridge solved many of those issues, and both the rifle and the cartridge are much more highly regarded now than they were 50 years ago. Now, interestingly, despite its small size, the original M193 5.6 NATO ammo had pretty effective terminal performance on so-called quote-unquote soft targets at close range, as was common in Vietnam. That is to say, the cartridge worked very well when the rifle was functioning properly. However, the military adopted the M16A2 rifle. Now, that rifle had a faster rifling twist rate, 1 7 inches versus 1 12 inches, and it adopted a new 5.56 NATO ball load during the 1980s, along with the M16A2. Now, incorporating a new bullet design with a steel penetrator, the new M855 ball load fired a 62 grain full metal jacket at about 3,025 feet per second. So a little bit heavier bullet, a little bit slower than the M193, and it had a different bullet construction. Like I said, this had a steel penetrator in it instead of just a plain lead core with a jacket on it, like the old M193. Now, the M855 is often referred to as quote-unquote green tip ammo because of the green paint on the bullet to make it easy to identify, especially when the M193 was still in use. Now, the M855, as you can imagine, penetrates much better than the M193, but the M855 developed a reputation for poor terminal performance. So the initial variants of the M16 and ammo that they used had a rifle that had some issues, but the ammo was pretty effective in combat. Fast forward a couple decades, the rifle was working much better, but the ammo was not as effective in combat. These stories started to creep up during the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, and then they really continued during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 20th century. Those complaints spurred the development of yet another ball load during the early 2000s. So the resulting M855 Alpha 1 load uses a lead-free 62-grain bullet made from a copper alloy with a steel penetrator. It is loaded to a higher pressure than the old M855 load, and it is designed for optimum performance out of short-barreled M4 carbines that were more commonly used by the military during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Once again, without going into too much detail, all things considered, the M855 Alpha 1 seems like it's been pretty well received, and it has a reputation for being more accurate, penetrating barriers more effectively, and also having better terminal performance than both the old M193 and M855 ball ammo. Now, since the M855 Alpha 1 uses a lead-free bullet, it is also more environmentally friendly than traditional lead core ammunition, and that includes both the 193 and the old M855 ammo. Now, I mentioned earlier that the M855 ball ammo had a steel penetrator. It did, but it also had a little bit of lead in its core as well, whereas the M855 Alpha 1 was completely lead-free. People refer to it as quote-unquote green ammo for that reason, because there's no lead in it. But that also results in confusion sometimes with green tip M855 ammo. But you put one right next to the other, very obvious differences between really all three of them. That's all a roundabout way of going into just enough detail to explain what I was mentioning earlier with both the M16 and the 5.56 NATO having a lot of problems that tarnish their reputation over the years. And that's especially pertinent for this discussion with the 5.56 versus the 7.62 by 39. It's hard for people to get past the problems that cartridge and that rifle had really a long time ago, but have since been fixed, either with modifications to the rifle itself, along with developments in ammunition that have occurred since then. And I know darn well that a lot of the skepticism that many people have towards using the 5.56 or the 223 for hunting big game are related either, one, to stories that they have heard or experienced about poor terminal performance with FMJ ammo in combat, along with people trying to hunt with, say, low-quality, cheap, full metal jacket ammo and having subpar results. The good news is that both the 7.62 by 39 and the 223 and 5.56 are currently available in several different types of factory ammunition using bullets much better suited for hunting game. You go from using a low-quality full metal jacket round in either one of them to some of this much better hunting stuff that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. It changes the game completely, especially for the 5.56. All right, now that we have the history of these cartridges out of the way, let's talk about their sizes in more detail, and then we'll move on to ballistics and all of that stuff. Now, when you compare the two cartridges side by side, the 5.56 by 45 is actually a tiny bit longer than the 7.62 by 39. But the 7.62 by 39 has a little bit fatter case, and it uses larger diameter bullets. Depending on the exact rifle and ammo that you're talking about here for the 7.62 by 39, there's a little bit of variation in bullet diameter, but you're usually looking at a bullet diameter of, say, around 0.310, 0.311, something like that. It's a tiny bit bigger than the 0.308 diameter bullets that are used by American 30 caliber cartridges. But bottom line, this is a 30 caliber cartridge compared to a 22 caliber cartridge for the 5.56 and the 223. It uses 224 caliber bullets. Now, that being said, the larger rim diameter of the 7.62 by 39 is offset a little bit by the longer and less tapered case of the 5.56 NATO. So for that reason, the two cartridges actually have almost the exact same case capacity. Now, the 5.56 NATO is not a SAMI cartridge, but the 223 Remington is extremely similar, and it is a SAMI certified cartridge, and it has a SAMI maximum pressure of 55,000 psi. The 7.62 by 39 is also a SAMI certified round. It has a maximum SAMI pressure of 45,000 psi, so it's loaded to quite a bit of lower pressure threshold than the 5.56 NATO. So main takeaways so far, the two cartridges are pretty similar in overall size, very similar in length. The 7.62 by 39 is a little bit fatter case, uses a bigger bullet, but it's also loaded to a lower pressure. Both cartridges have almost identical case capacity. So how's all that translate into different ballistic performance? All right, so long story short, the 223 and the 5.56 NATO both shoot smaller and lighter bullets at a much faster velocity than the 7.62 by 39. So here's an example comparing a couple different loads that'll give you an idea of what I mean. So first, let's take a Hornady Frontier 223 Remington load that's roughly comparable to the old 55 grain M193 military load. And the Hornady load, 55 grain full metal jacket bullet, .243 BC, 3,240 feet per second. Next, we have a 62 grain Barnes TSX load for the 5.56 NATO, .287 BC, 3,000 feet per second. And we have a Black Hills 5.56 NATO load using a 77 grain tipped Match King bullet, .420 BC, 2,750 feet per second muzzle velocity. This is a very hot item in some circles. If you know, you know. Moving on, we'll compare those three loads to a load for the 7.62 by 39 in Hornady's quote-unquote black line, shooting a 123 grain SST bullet, .295 BC, 2,350 feet per second. Now, as you can probably guess, all of the 223 Remington and 5.56 NATO loads have a significantly flatter trajectory than the 7.62 by 39. This is because they start out going much faster. Even the slower 77 grain tip Match King is still going 400 feet per second faster than the 7.62 by 39, and the higher velocity 55 grain bullet is going nearly 1,000 feet per second faster. Now, I would not say the 223 or the 5.56 has a laser flat trajectory, but it is a darn sight flatter than the 7.62 by 39. Now, on the other hand, since it uses a significantly heavier bullet, remember, we're talking 55, 62, 77 grain bullets versus a 123 grain bullet that is about twice as heavy or even heavier than the two lighter 223 and 5.56 loads. Now, on the other hand, even though it's going quite a bit slower, the fact that that 7.62 by 39 load is using a much heavier bullet, it has about 20% more muzzle energy than those 223 and 5.56 loads. So like I mentioned, first, it has a much more arcing trajectory because it's much slower than the 223 and 5.56 loads. But to be fair, the 7.62 by 39 is quite effective at the ranges it was designed to operate at. Remember, this was a cartridge intended for use at 300 yards and closer, though I think 200 yards and closer is more ideal for this cartridge. Under those conditions, it matches up pretty well to the 223 and 5.56. The higher BC 77 grain tip Match King passes it in the energy department around 200 yards, but the 7.62 by 39 still has the edge over the 55 grain and 62 grain loads in the energy department out to 500 yards. And there's not a gigantic practical difference in their trajectory at 200 yards and closer. Now, while the 7.62 by 39 uses a much heavier bullet that has a higher ballistic coefficient than two of the three 5.56 and 223 loads, the higher velocity 5.56 bullets still have a noticeable advantage over the lower velocity 7.62 by 39 in terms of wind drift. That's even more pronounced with the relatively high BC 77 grain tipped Match King bullet. At 500 yards, the 55 grain, 62 grain, and 77 grain loads drift 8.8 inches, 12.7 inches, and 22.7 inches less, respectively, than the 7.62 by 39 millimeter load. So yeah, that 77 grain tip Match King load has nearly 2 foot less wind drift at 500 yards than the 7.62 by 39. Once again, though, inside of 200 to 300 yards, where the 7.62 by 39 is most effective anyway, not a massive difference between these rounds. But with that said, the 223 and 5.56 do lend themselves better to use cases where a hunter might want to take a longer shot. I wouldn't shoot a deer with either round at 400 yards, for instance, but that's a doable shot on a coyote with a 223 or a 5.56. Not impossible, but much more difficult with the 7.62 by 39. Additionally, though the 7.62 by 39 is a pretty mild recoiling cartridge itself, especially compared to something like a 308 or a 30-06, the 5.56 NATO has a big advantage in this area. For example, when you fire them from rifles of the same weight, the 7.62 by 39 has about twice as much recoil as the 55 grain 5.56 NATO load. That being said, the 7.62 by 39 has a very mild recoil itself that most hunters should not have any problems with. It's just that the 5.56 NATO and 223 have extremely mild, almost non-existent recoil. Now let's talk about a couple of other pros and cons for each one. Now the advantage the 5.56 NATO has over the 7.62 by 39 in terms of a flatter trajectory and less wind drift stems from the fact that it shoots a considerably smaller and lighter bullet at a higher velocity. For instance, the vast majority of 223 and 5.56 factory loads shoot bullets in the 55 to 77 grain range. Of these, 55 and 62 grain bullet weights are most common. On the other hand, the larger diameter 7.62 by 39 uses factory loads with bullets in the 120 to 125 grain range, so a heavier but more narrow range. You'll see 122, 123 grain bullets being most popular. There's also some 125 grain bullets out there too, like there's a Remington core lock that weighs that much. Now, the cartridges have similar case capacity, but the 223 and 5.56 are loaded to a higher pressure. Combine that with the fact that they simply just shoot smaller and lighter bullets faster. That explains the differences in their trajectory. Now, that also plays into recoil. The 5.56 burns about the same amount of powder to launch a bullet that's less than half as heavy, about 50% faster than the 7.62 by 39. But that translates into quite a bit more recoil for the 7.62 by 39 because you're dealing with a bullet that is so much heavier. Now, in that same vein, the 7.62 by 39 just uses larger diameter bullets, like I mentioned earlier. They have almost twice as much frontal surface area as the 224 caliber bullets used by the 5.56 and the 223. All right, what about accuracy? Now, while the 5.56 NATO has a distinguished history of use in the hands of military and police snipers, designated marksmen, competition shooters, stuff like that, the 7.62 by 39 has gotten a lot of bad press for accuracy over the years. That's probably due to the fact that most people shooting the cartridge are using cheap military surplus ammo and rifles that we can politely describe as being built to looser tolerances. But it is a fact that a good SKS or AK is capable of surprising accuracy when using good ammo. Now, the Finnish RK-62, or the so-called Valmet rifle, that's basically a Finnish AK derivative, is a great example of a shockingly accurate rifle in 7.62 by 39 with the right ammo. Now, all things considered, though, it's still that cartridge, the 7.62 by 39, is still usually at a pretty significant disadvantage in terms of accuracy when compared to both the 5.56 NATO and the 223. I've owned several rifles in both 223 and 5.56 over the years. None were anything super special or expensive. Even so, all of them shot great. Now, I've also owned and shot several rifles in 7.62 by 39. All of them have been ho-hum in accuracy. Not as terrible as some people make them out to be, but nowhere near as good as the 223 and 5.56 rifles I've owned over the years. So yes, I feel pretty confident saying that the 223 and 5.56 have a noticeable advantage over the 7.62 by 39 in terms of accuracy. All right, now let's talk about ammo availability, pricing, variety, selection. The 223, 5.56, and 7.62 by 39 are extremely popular cartridges. There are tons of ammo choices for both. At least that was true until pretty recently. Now, traditionally, copper wash full metal jacket bullets with a steel case produced by companies like Brown Bear, Silver Bear, Tula, Wolf, Red Army Standard were the most common choices for 7.62 by 39 ammo out there. However, those same companies, plus others like Federal, Hornady, Remington, and Winchester, do make soft point or hollow point 7.62 by 39 hunting ammo as well. Now, the problem is that 7.62 by 39 ammo from those companies like Brown Bear and Tula are a lot harder to find now in the USA in 2024 than used to be the case. This is due to sanctions placed on Russia after the country invaded Ukraine in 2022. That didn't completely stop the import of all that ammo, and it was for all Russian-produced small arms ammo, not just the 7.62 by 39. But this did result in everyone who had import licenses for that stuff not getting their licenses renewed when they eventually expired. As far as I know, right now, as I record this, there is no new Russian-produced 7.62 by 39 ammo getting into the country now, and I do not expect that to change as long as the war in Ukraine continues. Now, that Tula and Brown Bear, Red Army Standard, all that stuff, that Wolf ammo, it has not disappeared from the market as I record this, but it is not as easy to find or as inexpensive as it used to be. Now, the Brown Bear, Silver Bear, Tula, Red Army Standard, Wolf ammo that I just mentioned is marketed for civilian use. There's also some truly military surplus 7.62x39 ammo out there. You'll see some M67 Yugoslavian ammo from time to time. Same thing with some surplus Chinese ammo, that sort of thing, right? That ammo was used by lots of countries all over the world. Many of them produce their own ammo. Oftentimes that stuff makes it into different countries as military surplus, and you can buy it and use it for yourself. But with a lot of that stuff, that truly military surplus ammo, it is corrosive. That's not the case with, especially, say, the Federal and Hornady ammo that you can buy. We'll talk about that in a second. And it's not the case for the Wolf ammo or any of that other stuff either. Now, that truly military surplus ammo, like I said, that does pop up from time to time. It's usually very reasonably priced, usually functions pretty well, but you need to be diligent about cleaning your rifle immediately after shooting it. That is especially true if you were shooting it in something other than an AK. More on this in a minute with rifle choices. So just keep an eye out for that sort of stuff. Now, fortunately, American ammo makers do produce 7.62x39 ammo, and they make it both for hunting and for general shooting at the range. For instance, right now, Hornady produces it in their black line with 123 grain SST. Federal makes it in their Power Shock line with 123 grain soft point. It's in the Remington Core Lock line with 125 grain Core Lock bullet. It's also in the Winchester PowerPoint and Deer Season XP lines. Both use 123 grain bullets, etc. All stuff like that. Now, all of those loads I just mentioned have ballistics very similar to what I described earlier. 123 grain-ish bullet, around 2,350 feet per second. So you don't have a tremendous amount of variety for this cartridge. There's a couple of exceptions. Hornady does make a subsonic load with a 255 grain sub-X bullet. They also make another load in their black line with a 111 grain monoflex bullet they advertise for use out of short-barreled rifles. But that's really about it as far as variety goes. There's just a couple of other factory loads out there, and they're all usually, like I said, around 120, 125 grains at around 2,300-ish feet per second. All of those loads I just mentioned are all perfectly suitable for hunting deer-sized game. Like I mentioned, out to 200-ish yards. It's not going to knock your socks off with performance, but it's nothing wrong with that stuff either. What about the 223 and 5.56? Now remember, a rifle with a 5.56 NATO chamber can usually safely and accurately fire 223 Remington ammo. The reverse, usually not true. So to recap, if you have a 223 Remington chamber, like for instance, if you have a Browning X-Bolt in 223 Remington, you should only shoot 223 Remington ammo in it. On the other hand, if you have a rifle with a 5.56 NATO chamber, you can shoot 5.56 NATO ammo in it, or 223 Remington ammo in it. Most AR-15s have either a 5.56 NATO or a 223 Wild chamber in them. Now, a 223 Wild chamber can also shoot 223 Remington and 5.56 NATO ammo safely. If you follow those guidelines, you're unlikely to run into any problems. Now, 7.62x39 is not interchangeable with anything. If you have a 7.62x39 rifle of one kind or another, only try and shoot 7.62x39 ammo in it. Do not attempt to shoot 7.62x25 ammo, 7.62x51 ammo, 7.62x54R ammo, or anything like that. It is not interchangeable with any of those other cartridges, despite their similar names. Now let's get back to the 223 and 5.56. Now when you take into account the fact that most 5.56 NATO rifles can use 223 Remington ammo without trouble, there's clearly a very wide variety of ammo available for use in those rifles. This ammo ranges from match grade and surplus full metal jacket ammo, best suited to work at the range on one end of the spectrum, to hollow point, soft point, ballistic tip ammo designed for hunting and personal protection on the other end of the spectrum. Now note that full metal jacket ammo generally not legal for hunting most states. So while that military surplus 5.56 ammo is good for use at the range, same thing with the 7.62x39, I don't recommend taking it afield hunting. Now, pretty much every ammo manufacturer produces a wide variety of 223 and or 5.56 NATO ammo. This is an especially popular varmint round, so virtually every major style of varmint bullet is available in these cartridges. The Barnes Varmint Grenade, the Berger Varmint Hollow Point, Hornady NTX and VMAX, Nosler Ballistic Tip, and Varmageddon, Remington AccuTip V, the Spear TNT, all of that stuff. It's also available in a variety of plain old soft point bullets from a variety of manufacturers suitable for big game hunting. Now, SAAMI's spec twist rate for the 223 is 1 in 12 inches. However, it is not unusual to find rifles in 223 or especially 5.56 NATO with a faster 1 in 9, 1 in 8, or even 1 in 7 inch twist rate. Those rifles can use longer, heavier, higher BC bullets. To that end, there are 223 Remington or 5.56 NATO loadings utilizing projectiles along those lines like the 55 grain, 62 grain, and 70 grain TSX from Barnes, the 62 grain Federal Fusion, 64 grain PowerShock soft points, the 50 grain and 55 grain CX, 73 grain FTX, 75 grain Interlock from Hornady, 70 grain AccuBond from Nosler, 77 grain tipped Match King from Sierra, 64 grain PowerPoint, and Extreme Point from Winchester. So add it all up and you have an incredible variety of ammo for the 223 and 5.56. In fact, you have a much larger variety of ammo for those cartridges than is the case for the 7.62 by 39. The same is also true with ammo availability in general. Now, the details do vary depending on the specific ammo you're talking about. And none of these cartridges are very expensive. They're usually available at the lower end of price points for hunting ammo, but generally 223 and 5.56 ammo are usually less expensive than 7.62 by 39 ammo too. Okay, let's talk about rifles now. Probably due to the military roots of these cartridges, the 5.56 NATO and the 7.62 by 39 are most commonly chambered in semi-automatic rifles. In particular, AR platforms are very popular with the 5.56 NATO. On the other hand, the 7.62 by 39 is available in a number of different AK variants. There are a few AR-15 variants chambered in 7.62 by 39, but it's not nearly as common. That's because the extreme taper of the cartridge necessitates the use of special magazines, and the larger diameter of the cartridge, larger rim diameter of the cartridge, requires a new bolt carrier, firing pin. There's just a lot more that goes into making a 7.62 by 39 AR-15 function properly than is the case with the AR-15 and the 223 and 5.56. And like I mentioned, you need special magazines for the 7.62 by 39. If you put a 7.62 by 39 magazine right next to a 5.56 or a 223 magazine, the 7.62 by 39 magazine is much more more curving, has a more banana shape to it than is the case with the 223 and 5.56 magazines. Both cartridges are available in other styles of rifles too. For instance, you can get a Howa Mini in 7.62 by 39. Same thing with the Ruger American Ranch rifle. And like I mentioned earlier, you can get something like a Browning X-Bolt or even something like a Winchester XPR bolt-action rifle in 223 as well. And of course, the semi-automatic Ruger Mini 14 and Mini 30 rifles are available in 5.56 and 7.62 by 39, respectively. Okay, so with all that said, which one is right for you? All right, so roughly comparable to the 30-30 Winchester in terms of power, the 7.62 by 39 is well suited for hunting medium-sized game at short to medium range. Basically, if you think the 30-30 is adequate for the job, the 7.62 by 39 should also do just fine in the same situation. Now, while it is absolutely capable of cleanly taking big game, the 223 and the 5.56 are really just borderline big game hunting rounds. It's not legal for deer hunting in some states, but I will say the advent of better quality bullets in recent years has made the 223 Remington and 5.56 much more effective for big game hunting than they used to be. And since they're commonly available in semi-automatic rifles and have such a light recoil, follow-up shots are very easy with both rounds as well. So that makes them pretty popular for hunting situations that require a lot of shooting, like feral hog control, for instance. And when using a quality bolt, the 5.56 NATO will reliably do a number on all but the biggest hogs, and the same is also true for deer, provided it is legal to hunt deer with wherever you are hunting. Now, for me personally, you are welcome to disagree with me here, but for me personally. I think the 5.56 NATO and 223 on one hand and the 7.62 by 39 are best suited for different tasks. I think the 223 and the 5.56 are best for varmint hunting, pest control, stuff like that. And I think the 7.62 by 39 is better for bigger game hunting. And I really think it is ideal for deer and hog size game. You can use it on antelope. You can use it on black bear. You could even use it on elk. I think those situations are just a little bit outside of the ideal use cases for the 7.62 by 39 though. Like I said, 200 yards and in on game, more or less the size of a deer. Now, the flat trajectory and lightly constructed nature of mini bullets, most common with the 5.56 and 223, make it great for taking shots at small, thin-skinned animals like prairie dogs, coyotes, foxes, bobcats. On the other hand, the 7.62 by 39 has an advantage when hunting larger game, deer, feral hogs, and like I said, even black bear, because it shoots heavier and larger diameter bullets. Drilling down into things a little more, if you prefer the AR-15 platform, both cartridges are available in it, but the AR-15 is just more compatible with the 5.56 NATO than it is with the 7.62 by 39. By the same token, if you like the AK, well, the 7.62 by 39 is the way to go. If you're looking for the lowest recoiling option, the 5.56 NATO is the way to go here. 7.62 by 39 isn't bad. 5.56 NATO has much less recoil. If you primarily want something to hunt varmints with, then the 223 and 5.56 probably the way to go. Likewise, if you do more hunting for a bigger game and you're stuck between these two cartridges, I'd lean towards the 7.62 by 39. And if ammo availability and pricing are very important to you, well, I think the 223 and 5.56 have the edge there as well. Okay, so that will do it with the rundown on things with these two cartridges. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope this cleared up some of the confusion that is out there with the 7.62 by 39 and the 5.56/223 Remington. As usual, I have written a really detailed article about these cartridges for the Big Game Hunting blog. I will be sure to put a link to that article in the show notes so you can check it out. I've also put links to ammo recommendations for both cartridges in the show notes too. Same is also true with other accessories like hearing protection, slings, scopes, stuff like that. Check out those URLs in the show notes to learn more. And don't forget, join my email list at huntingguns101.com or through the other link in the show notes. If you like the podcast, you'll love those daily emails. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.